So how does one actually defend the Baltic states? Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin. I want to first of all thank a lot of new Lithuanian viewers who have reached out on this channel following a video we did on basically pagan Lithuanian history, the uniqueness of Lithuania in the world and its important cultural contribution to Western society, and of course my personal love and affection for that country where I've been many times. My personal area of expertise, though, is in foreign policy, strategic policy, and I've been heavily involved in Lithuanian strategic affairs for many years. So this is a good opportunity to, with these new viewers and perhaps as a bridge with the rest of the community here, talk about the history of Lithuanian security and why it is so increasingly important for Eastern European affairs today. So for those that may not know, Lithuania is a country located in the Baltic with Estonia, Latvia to its east, and then Belarus, where a lot of things are happening at the moment, Poland, the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad to the west, and the Baltic Sea to Sweden. And now, why is it so much more important now than it has been in the past? Well, the first issue is the shifting borders of NATO. So after the Cold War ended and there was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of the Russian Federation sort of phoenixed out of that, Germany was unified, Western and East Germany, and the collective Germany was brought into NATO. Now, the Russian government at the time believed that they had a deal with the Americans that the NATO border would not stretch any further east than that. Now, that will be a whole separate topic to discuss the history of that, but the reality is that didn't happen, and there was an eastward expansion of NATO, NATO being a collective security arrangement wherein under the NATO Charter an attack on one is an attack on all. That NATO will be defended with all elements of American power, including nuclear weapons. And so it's a very serious and significant military alliance, of course, created and exclusively devoted to the defeat of the Soviet Union, but then with a broadening range of security interests after the Soviet Union collapsed. So the eastward expansion is actually a very important story when it comes to Lithuania itself, okay? Because you can divide the NATO powers into two main categories, right? You've got your traditional NATO powers of like Britain, France, West Germany and all of that. And now you've got the former Soviet occupied countries that have got their independence, Poland, the Baltic states and so on. And they have very different perceptions of what the alliance is about and why they're in it. So France, for example, does not consider itself to be worried about Russian invasion anymore, right? They just don't, it's not part of their security thinking. And they see NATO primarily in the context of quote unquote security promotion. So stabilization operations abroad, counterterrorism, coalition operations in places like Afghanistan and so forth. And they're not worried about NATO in terms of collective security to protect their own sovereign borders, okay? Whereas completely different mentality for Poland and the Baltic states and the Eastern NATO partners, who are part of NATO exclusively for the purposes of worrying about Russian militarism and Russian revanchism. And they look at things like what's happening in Ukraine, potentially what's happening now in Belarus, which is an interesting case. We'll do more videos on that in the future. And they say, look, we are in NATO because of the concerns about Russia, right? Now, how did they get into NATO? It's a very important question. Now, Lithuania joined NATO after the Iraq War. Lithuania and the other Baltic partners contributed to the Iraq conflict at a time when France and Germany were bitterly critical of the intervention. Now, of course, Lithuania wasn't worried about Saddam Hussein. What they wanted was support from the American administration to join NATO. And at the time, the Americans needed friends, right? They had a significant amount of consternation when it came to what they called old Europe, Donald Rumsfeld's famous quote, which is to say, these are sort of self-interested, dependent, not willing to invest in their own security, not willing to support American allies. Americans needed support for their coalition going into Iraq, and in exchange, essentially, for the support that Lithuania and others provided, not through, obviously, a massive contribution from military forces, but the political cover to say that, look, this is a broad coalition of nations. The Americans, of course, threw their support behind the accession of the Baltic countries to NATO and then also later the EU. So that partnership really created a sort of a special relationship between the United States and the Baltic, in large part because it happened at a time when America was really needed friends and was having a lot of conflict with its traditional Western European allies. So that sort of brought them into the tent, so to speak. But it had an interesting and important geopolitical consequence, because while the US was absolutely capable of defending West Germany with its huge array of military and nuclear forces, that was very clear to the Soviet Union. Also, the fact that the fall of Western Europe to Soviet occupation would have posed such an existential threat to the United States itself that it was credible that the United States would start a major war, even a nuclear war, to prevent that from happening, right? So that actually kept a very tenuous peace along that Central European Iron Curtain sort of fault line. When you expand NATO right up to the Russian border, as it is today, it's not at all clear that, the Spaniards are willing to mobilize nationally to defend these Eastern European allies. And so now there is an increased tension between the Eastern European NATO allies that I mentioned before that are in it primarily to protect this eastern border, and those that see NATO as kind of a coalition of democracies aimed at promoting human rights and security and counterterrorism around the world, right? So the attitudes, if you poll Germans, if you poll French, very few of them have any appetite to defend the Baltic states. The only country in NATO that consistently polls, other than the countries themselves, of course, consistently polls in favor of defending those countries is the United States itself. So that's a real testament, I think, to American sincerity, that they're willing to actually spend their blood and treasure to defend distant allies, even allies that are very far away from their own borders and their own national security, because they are genuine friends and supporters, right? So that's just a little side note. Now, militarily, it creates an interesting problem, because geographically, these countries are quite flat. The distance between the eastern border and the western Baltic shore of Lithuania isn't that far. It's like 400 or 500 kilometers. And so if a major advance was to come from the eastern border, it'd be very difficult to defend. And unlike when you have Western Europe, the next country over is Sweden, right? Now, Sweden is not a NATO ally, and this has really rebordered the geopolitical tensions between all of these countries, right? Because all war plans to defend the Baltic rely on control of Swedish airspace. That is that if, let's say, there was an invasion of Lithuania, the Lithuanians would be supported by the Poles and a few others temporarily. And in order to push back such an advance, it would rely on 24-hour air sorties from Swedish airfields, okay? So think about this so far. We no longer have this purely land barrier in the middle of Europe. What we have with Lithuania is a thing that's very, very close to Russian supply lines, a body of water at its back, a country that is in part of NATO, and a lot of countries in the west part of Europe that aren't enthusiastic about the idea of a conflict over the Baltic states, but with resolute commitment from the United States. So the Swedes have kind of quietly agreed that in the unlikely event of a military showdown in the Baltic, they would provide airspace to American aircraft, right? And the Gotland Island that exists in the Baltic between Sweden and the Baltic states is being remilitarized. So that had been demilitarized, and now it's being remilitarized. The Lithuanian state itself, for a very long time, had a totally negligible defense budget. When I started out in dealing with Lithuanian strategic affairs, they spent less than 1% of their GDP on defense, a GDP that wasn't particularly huge to begin with. And I think this was just purely a recognition on the Lithuanian part that they don't have a military that could defend themselves properly, and that they actually relied on allies to support them. That is changed quite dramatically, and that part of this has to be attributed to Donald Trump. Part of it, of course, attributable to the Ukraine intervention that brought attention back to the idea that Russia could try and redraw some of the European borders. For the Trump administration, it's the resolute pressure to get all NATO allies to contribute to the minimum, at least, agreed threshold for defense spending for each NATO partner, which is 2% of GDP. Germany is a joke. They fall well below that. France is absurd. They fall well below that. I think the UK is pretty close to the mark, and that countries like Greece and things like that are within that ballpark. But these major European countries have been freeloading. The US has had something like 35,000 troops in Germany for decades, defending the Germans. So you have this enormously wealthy country of 80 plus million people, more than itself a GDP 3 times that of Russia, not willing to spend the money on its own national security, but certainly willing to fight to the last American. So the Trump administration has, to its great credit, said, look, if you aren't going to contribute to your own national defense, then you are militarily irrelevant for NATO, and we can't necessarily assure your security. Whereas Lithuania has managed to bring its defense spending up quite a bit, and is continuing that trajectory very strongly, which is great, and is showing to the rest of to the NATO countries how it's done. And the Americans are, again, grateful for that. So one thing that comes up time and again with Lithuania is its understanding of America's national strategic interests, its domestic political affairs, and being able to do very effective alliance management with the United States. I think that's just one fixture. So this thread leads into a broader story between the US and Russia over Lithuania. Because Sweden's airspace must be controlled by NATO forces in the event of any conflict over Lithuania, Russia has been developing these missiles that I believe are conventional. I don't think these are nuclear missiles, to basically disrupt and disable Swedish airfields in the event of a conflict. So in a sense, Sweden's neutrality, by virtue of Lithuania now being part of NATO, is no longer possible, right? Because irrespective of what Sweden tries to do, it will either be utilized by NATO, or it'll be attacked by Russia, or both, right? Because Russia will need to deny these airfields to NATO aircraft in order to have a struggle over the Baltic states. So Lithuania now is in this incredibly strange situation where it's now the fault line between Russia and NATO, right? Before it had been occupied, it won its independence. There was this period of time where it was almost like a buffer state between the two because it wasn't part of NATO but was independent of Russia. And now it is formally a Western NATO ally, with national service reintroduced, with an increasing defense budget, with a annual military exercises, both with the United States in the form of joint forces with the Baltic states and also Poland, and the need, and is a including, because of part of NATO, a nuclear dependence. The Baltic states at the moment, I think, are fairly secure because Russia is in serious trouble, right? Economically, the pandemic has hit them really hard. Oil prices have tanked. They've got problems in Belarus. They just don't have what's required to be expansionist in the sense of reclaiming a Russian empire, one that would actually involve Lithuanian territory. Nevertheless, there is a fixture of instability in this part of the world. And what we actually do need in terms of the rise of China and America's orientation towards America first and moving towards a hegemonic competition with China, it needs to improve its relationship with Russia. And that Baltic question will need to be answered as part of that. So in Europe, it's a massive land theatre. Army, land forces, tanks, all of that is very important. But in the Pacific, it's air and sea power. And America doesn't have the strength anymore to do both everywhere, right? So it needs to focus on China and is increasingly putting all its military investment, resources, orientation into that, while drawing down troops in Europe, expecting the Europeans to do more for their own security. And so Lithuania over time is going to be finding itself in a situation where, yes, they still have like rhetorical and emotional support from the United States, but direct military support will be limited by America's capability, not by America's intention. And as a consequence of that, there'll also be a strong push in the United States to improve relations with Russia because they'll want to tease Russia away from China's orbit in order to further isolate China. This will be a long-term, decades-long mission for American grand strategy. So what Lithuania should start thinking to do now is how to improve relations with Russia. I know that's a really sensitive issue and it's a big thing to say. How to improve relations with Russia to find a long-term political settlement that ensures Lithuanian security, benefits the United States because then they can start to take attention away from that and increases Lithuanian influence in Washington. Lithuania has done a lot of really good things in that space. They did that. Whatever you can say for the Iraq war, okay? And, I think it was a strategic disaster if you look at it broadly. For Lithuania, it was immensely beneficial because it brought them into focus as an American friend, a friend when they really needed them, ensured American support for joining NATO and the EU. Certainly the biggest transformation in Lithuanian security, since its independence, and also afterwards. Been very beneficial with the US when it comes to promoting US interests when Lithuania has had the EU presidency, all this kind of stuff, being very big in increasing its military budget, like I mentioned, to embarrass some of the other countries that haven't been pulling their own weight. So really reading the tea leaves of what each American administration does. The next thing they should do is think about how they can support America's challenge with China. And the best way to do that is to think of different ways to develop a political settlement with Russia that ensures their independence, helps improve relations between Europe and Russia in such a way that the Americans can start engaging with Russia in a better way. Very difficult to do right now with Belarus. That is a difficult situation that's throwing a real spanner in the works. But despite that crisis, there may be some opportunities. So I will have other videos and things to say on that. But I hope this kind of puts a broad spectrum of all the interesting things that are the history of Lithuania's security challenges since its liberation from Soviet occupation, its relationship with NATO, its building of its alliances, and hopefully that's informative to you. If you have any comments or questions on this subject, please leave them down below. happy to answer them. I think it's something that is really under-discussed, given it is such a massive flashpoint in the world at the moment. If you find value in this, please like and subscribe. And we have a growing Lithuanian audience, which is great. And so what we'll do is we'll have Lithuania as a fixture of our programming. We'll have regular videos on Lithuania, not just in security, but in everything like the last video. Going forward, so we can bring Lithuania into the world. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.